Hello, this is Peter Bell, and I'm here with Mr. Brandon MacDonald from Fireweed Zinc. Hello, Brandon.
Hey, how's it going, Peter?
Wonderful. First time to be talking with you. Real treat. I've been an investor in Fireweed since IPO, and love to hear about the history of the company briefly.
Sure. Yeah, let's do it.
So, I've pulled up Dawson City map here. As a touch point, what relationship does this spot in the Yukon have to the company?
Well, we don't do much in Dawson except to go for the annual conference, which is a great affair. You were there this year, and it's good. I think Dawson's got to be one of my favorite places in the world. It's got such a unique history, and they've managed to preserve the feel of the city in a way that just, everywhere else struggles to do.
Yeah. And I had the pleasure to talk with you. I'll zoom in here, right into a small little park here that you might see in the view. And Laura, we set up a conference in there and had a bunch of meetings. It was amazing to have the 10-minute brief interactions with different companies throughout the day, right in this sports baseball diamond here.
Yeah. No, and it's a good show. No, it's one of my favorite events of the year. Probably actually my favorite event of the year.
Did you see anybody from any of your major company partner on your project at Dawson this year? Was there any representation from any of the?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I think our biggest investor there was maybe Willem from Commodity Discovery Fund.
A celebrity on Twitter with lots of activity going on. It's amazing to see him. I didn't. Yeah.
Yeah, I always make sure to tag him anytime I can, so that his audience sees it.
Wonderful. Has he been? Well, I wonder again this experience for you of starting a company, right? And I believe this was the first time that you were taking a company public in this way.
Yeah, and I mean, I've been involved in a few juniors before, but this is my first IPO, and it was my first time in the big chair, so to speak, right? So it's a neat experience to be able to run a company and do all that yourself.
You've done a
Not
great
that
job.
not that anyone does it themselves. I mean, it's like
No, it's such a team project. It's amazing, isn't it?
yeah, yeah,
One thing I do like that's come up that's kind of related to doing it yourself is just being focused, a project specific vehicle in this case.
yeah. I think that's served us well so far. Look, I think there's validity in a variety of different approaches. I think there's validity in multi-project companies and not just as prospect generators. I think there's validity in multi-project companies that are advancing them, particularly if you're building out a pipeline or if there's some sort of cohesive strategy. But for us, you know, we picked up what we thought was a great asset, and it kept getting better. And I mean, little known fact about Fireweed that the original plan was not to stop with McMillan Pass. We planned to start with McMillan Pass and then look at potential other acquisitions accumulating in the zinc space. But McMillan Pass ended up being so great, and to our mind, our valuation never reflected the strength of the project. And it's difficult to use your shares as currency to make acquisitions when you're not getting a relative valuation that makes sense, right?
The line in the sand for juniors this summer seems to have been $5 million for a lot of the exploration companies and high risk ventures that I look at. It's pretty amazing to see that as a baseline. Very using there's not a lot of currency there.
No, and yeah, that's the problem. Even if you're looking at a merger of equals with another junior, you got to give a lot of thought about what's the relative valuation here. Am I getting part of their project, or am I really just giving them part of mine?
And it's in this view, isn't it? The project area
No, it's further
that we're looking
northeast
at.
to where you are there, right near the border. You can see where it says Mackenzie Mountains, just to the left of that. Go up. You probably want to
Yep.
orient yourself north-south there. Yeah, zoom in there. Yeah, it's almost centered there.
Wow. It's an amazing place to go and zoom around at.
Yeah, no, it's
Is this it?
yeah, you're well, the big mountain you see in the mid left there is Keel Mountain.
Yeah.
So we're just a little bit south of that. You can see a little valley. No, no, that's not south because you're check your compass. You're not facing north.
Yep.
Um, so it's pretty great place to be working, and you never really tire of the views there. Yeah,
Well,
zoom
and
in
how do you,
straight there, and you're basically looking at it. Yeah, that valley. Follow that valley up. Yeah, there you go. Now you're basically centered right on the project.
and so there's the potential for a mine out here.
Yeah, look, that's what we think, and that's never we've never shied away from the fact that the chief challenge with the project is location. When you're, I don't know what it is, but as a crow flies, but 800 kilometers as a truck drives from port, um, that's a material impact on developing a project. But if this project with the resource it has was 200 kilometers from port, it would have been a hole in the ground 30 years ago,
Yes.
right? So the opportunity for investors is either exploration and discovery, right? Or it's finding value in existing projects where circumstances have changed, or perhaps where the project has not been adequately understood. And that's what we saw. We saw this was the core of the project. Tom and Jason deposits were buried deep in Hud Bay, and they hadn't done any work on them in quite a long time. So the question for us was, like, look, if we can get this for a reasonable price, does it make sense? And we could. We were able to secure it for a good price.
Brandon, thank you very much for mentioning the history of the project and where it came from. Talking with you about being project specific and everything, I wonder if you could tell us briefly about the history of it. And
yeah,
okay.
so that area first saw modern development during the Second World War. So what had happened was as the U.S. Army was building the Alaska Highway, they also built what was the Canal Road, Canada Oil Road, which ran from near Whitehorse to Norman Wells, Northwest Territories. Norman Wells had some oil fields there, and the idea was that they built this road to facilitate the construction of a pipeline to bring oil from Norman Wells to Whitehorse to a refinery there. So the idea was that a overland source of fuel might be necessary to fuel trucks and what have you heading to Alaska, or to fuel Alaska itself if the Japanese invaded the mainland, or if the Japanese controlled the Pacific in such a way that you could not move fuel by boat. So this pipeline was built, and that was basically the road that bisects our property, is the Canal Road. Now, after the Second World War, the oil pipeline stopped pumping oil, and the road on the Northwest Territory side ceased to be maintained, but it is still maintained on the Yukon side. So originally, the Geological Survey of Canada was doing work in that area, and they had identified potential for zinc mineralization, and prospectors for Hud Bay followed up on that and found the Tom deposit in 1951.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and you've been to site, so you've seen the kind of discovery outcrop. Now, I don't know if that's the actual discovery outcrop, but it is an outcrop of impressive mineralization, and it was one that if you followed the sulfides up the talus slope, you could find. Yeah. And so it was a relatively easy, quote unquote, project to find. If you set foot in that valley, a trained eye could probably find that outcrop without a lot of difficulty. So Hud Bay had done some work there, and then in the 70s, working on a theory that there was more in that region than just Tom. Some companies, a joint venture of companies called the Ogilvy Ogilvy JV started doing work in the Jason area and discovered the Jason deposit, Jason Main first, and then later Jason South.
Wow.
Um, so, in the last real activity in the region was up to 1991 when Phelps Dodge had Jason under option from the Ogilvy JV, and Kaminko had the Tom deposit under option from Hud Bay. And then come 1991, the zinc market pretty much imploded,
Yeah.
and both those two, big companies dropped their options, and the projects basically sat under care and maintenance until Hud Bay bought Jason in 2006, and then did a little bit of metallurgy in 2011, and then sold it to us in 2013. So, by the time 2013, sorry, 2016, or agreed to sell it to us, and we closed that transaction in 2018 outright. And
Thank you.
it's you think the last time real work was done there was 1991. And we're the first people to do real work that not just have both Tom and Jason, but have the rest of the district we've put together.
And you're doing minerals exploration work, sophisticated scientific, creative activity.
Yeah, because we look the same logic that allowed them to find Jason, and then further down the main basin bounding fault allowed them to find boundary zone, is what we think is going to allow us to find more. Like, we don't think this district is done yet, but exploration is tricky, right? I mean, exploration is a game of good science, persistence, and then a dash of luck, because the best theories in the world doesn't mean they're right. You can have great science and you may still be wrong.
But I think of how far the science has come in 30 years, right? You talk about 1991, we talk about 2020, 2021, 2031. So 1991 to 2020, right? That's 30 years. Sorry, just to say again.
Yeah, no, and exactly. And I think that, it's everything from not just the way we do exploration and the advances in geophysics and geochemistry, et cetera, that have been done since then, but also our understanding of how these deposits have formed is a bit different now than it was then. So it changes the way you explore them and where you might be looking.
And does the world need another discovery of one of these, right? And
well, it definitely does, right? And that's broadly the case with all base metals, is that there's been an underinvestment in exploration, and that's the thesis for continuing exploration and looking for more of these things. The fleeting whims of the short-term market and trade wars and stuff like that can only delay the inevitable in terms of needing to replace these projects.
And where are they going to come from? Looking at the Yukon as a well-maintained jurisdiction with new mines coming on stream right now, right? So much growth potential. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And yet there is some parallel in between, the 30 years of exploration time that you can bring to bear in this area, right? There's some pent-up work to be done in terms of the development, I think, as well. Lots of potential to jump in with new types of infrastructure that work better from the start, right? And for Yukon to be, carte blanche a little bit, you can do the best practices really from what is continuing to be an important, mining jurisdiction in Canada, right? The history of mining here and everything is profoundly important, to Canada and the world.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that it's an area that is still, incredibly underexplored. And when you think about underexplored regions, it's it's like the North and the in Africa and stuff like that, right? So pick your
Egypt,
poison in terms of risks, right?
Let me even point out that Egypt is a place that's going through some changes as similar to Ecuador years ago, with Wood Mackenzie in there advising the government. and potential growth of a mining industry from the start, right? And how
Yeah.
challenging that is, versus doing it in the Yukon where people understand mining and have been doing it for generations.
Yeah. Yeah. And exactly. And I think that there is a first mover advantage sometimes in these nascent resource economies like the Egypts and what have you that are coming to terms with what they may be sitting on. But there's also a bit of a first mover disadvantage because you're coming in with no legal system, with a government that may not understand it or may not want it, right?
Yes, yes.
I mean, look at what's happening in Japan. Very exciting with Japan Gold and Irving there. But at the same time, you're dealing with a country that is very unsure about drill permits and how to permit a mine, etc. So you have to offset that versus prospectivity and what have you, right?
Yes, yes, certainly. And mineability. And speaking to mineability, the screen share we have here, this is the picture of the contact page on your website.
Yeah.
And isn't that just representative of some of the wonderful places to work in the Yukon?
Yeah, it was look, it's um, the Yukon, particularly the right places in the Yukon, it's the best place in the world to work in summer. It's beautiful. Although I always maintain like that photo is a great example of in the high alpines, it's wonderful. As soon as you get into the valley, the mosquitoes can get a little thick.
Yeah.
So it's not always, when you're working in the buckbrush and it's wet and it's hot and there's mosquitoes everywhere, it's not always a picnic.
That's one thing that was striking to me about visiting Victoria Gold Mines was how much we were really up in the stratosphere a little bit. It felt like there was some clouds that rolled through with thunder and lightning in the distance, and we were right up there. It almost seemed like pretty high up.
Yeah, yeah.
So, and just to look again at this picture, what are we looking at here?
So you're looking down the valley towards the airstrip. So the airstrip would be down that valley a little bit. Tom would be
Yeah.
to your right, and Jason would be to your left.
And are they shown? Is that
No, neither of them are in that picture.
okay? But this is where the airstrip is for the project.
Yeah, just about a kilometer or two down the road there.
What an amazing area to have to build a mine, right? We think about some of these places that are in steep terrain that don't have this kind of working room.
Yeah.
The amount of simplifications this comes with for all the yards and mine facilities, right? You
Yeah.
can just have wonderful efficiencies in your
Yeah.
operational planning and design, right? And then you're talking about the mines of the future, right? What do the mines of the future look like with autonomous vehicles and this kind of working space? So that's all at surface, but I just ask, underground mining here, is that
That would be most of what we would imagine would happen with this project. Most of the resource exists underground to deep underground.
yeah.
So the assumption would be that you would mine it primarily by underground mining, which has its own advantages and challenges, right? Um, Challenge, of course, is cost and logistics of that. Advantage is you just simply have a lower footprint in an underground operation. You don't produce as much waste rock. You don't leave a giant hole in the ground. So it's a bit simpler in terms of permitting, but perhaps more complicated in terms of actual operation. Well, not perhaps,
Certainly.
Definitely more complicated.
And there's still an audience for that risk and that business, right? And looking at who's come in to this company, and thinking about when does a project, specific junior have a successful conclusion, right? And what does that look like?
Yeah, and that's a big question for us. We welcomed Tech as an investor this year. They took 9.9% of the company. We have resource capital funds out of Colorado as a big investor, and we have, our project is so big that we have the attention of basically all the zinc players in the world. Converting that to a meaningful and profitable transaction is the challenge ahead of us, right? It's not simply enough to do a resource statement and hope you get taken out, right? There's challenges, particularly with base metal projects. There's so much more to it, about metallurgy and concentrate salability, et cetera, that have to be demonstrated, usually before you get a transaction.
And so with your budgeting, right, we see the 43101 reports that are available. I wonder, how much are you allocating efforts within that framework without, kind of, are you jumping around in the queue of work programs, what people might normally do, like with doing metallurgy sooner, or is that work generally, appropriate to prioritize with a known deposit like this?
Well, I would say, our PEA was a great example of, it is a PEA, it doesn't meet the standards for a PFS, but some of our things were quite advanced for a PEA.
Yeah.
The metallurgy work we did was quite involved for a PEA. We didn't have to do that for a study of that level, but we thought it was important to know these things. We thought it was important to get ahead of any challenges regarding, deleterious elements or concentrate quality, right? And, as it turns out, we look like we're going to produce a very saleable and attractive concentrate. But all the same, that's something you want to nail down, because those con buyers are potentially your biggest partners.
And that's pretty limited news flow around that kind of business activity.
Well, and it's pretty dry to the average investor. The average investor does really not give a shit about metallurgical results, right?
And yet it's so critical.
Yeah, well, they might punish you for really bad metallurgy, but they're unlikely to reward you for good metallurgy, because, and this is the issue, you see companies that have a good resource and have not yet done metallurgy, and everyone assumes in their base case that the metallurgy is good. So it can only possibly be rated down when you do the metallurgy. Yeah. And so that's part of the challenge for, as a CEO or management of a company, is like, for things like that really in the market could only hurt you. You need them, but do you do them, right? And
turn over that card as soon as possible.
Yeah, like even a PEA, right? I mean, I think every zinc junior that's done a PEA in the last couple of years has been hammered on the back of it, right? Recently happened to Tinka, Vendetta, Fireweed. It's as predictable as clockwork and as depressing as anything, right? But you have to do it. But all the same, that your investors have completely unrealistic expectations about what they're going to see there, right?
Is there any potential, for trial mining or bulk sampling to help add some allure to, the metallurgy?
Yeah, in terms of a bulk sample, we could take it from above ground, or we do have quite a significant amount of underground workings, but it would cost a couple $1 million to reopen those. So access. Yeah. Look, what it cost me to reopen the underground, I make back in saved meters on drilling. But it still requires that upfront capital to do that, right?
The calculations of a junior mining company, right?
Yeah.
It's
particularly in a challenging market like this, like, you don't have all the capital you want, so you got to really start making some tough decisions. And sometimes there can be things that add value, but that getting halfway to does not add value. So
how much does tech kind of set? How much do you do what tech wants versus how much you might do what the market wants? And is there a distinction even between those?
No, not really. I don't pander to the market. I don't think that's a good way to run a company long term. You might get some brief signs of life in your stock if you pander to the market, but then you just end up worse on the other side of it, right? So we try to do its best for this project in the long term.
Hello again. This is Peter Bell, and I'm here with Mr. Brandon MacDonald. We're going to have a look at the technical report for Fireweed Zinc. Brandon?
Yeah, I don't think we need to flip through the document, but maybe if you can pull up the presentation.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
That's a pretty big and dry document.
I love going through those things. I always like to skip to the back and then read them, read them backwards. You see the funniest things.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. So here's a copy of the presentation. What are we looking at in
Yeah.
this photo? If I could just briefly ask. Thanks.
Yeah, that's looking towards the Tom deposit and the nestle in the mountains there.
Yep.
And you can see the road leading to it.
Okay.
But if you scroll down to the resource update, um, I could talk to you a little bit about the significance of that. There you go. So, this is the resource update we put out in 2018, early January. 11.2 million tons indicated, 39.5 million tons inferred, both around that 10% zinc equivalent. That is pretty damn big.
Yeah.
And that is a very healthy grade. And what's amazing about that is that, that doesn't include any drilling we've done since then, does not include the Tom North zone, the end zone, the boundary zone. So it's not hard to imagine this being significantly better than it already is, once we roll those things in. But even without it rolled in, if you go to the next slide, it's about 4.5 million tons contained zinc plus lead, which is one of the biggest sort of top 50 zinc lead deposits in the world. And starting to move up towards that top 20 range where you sort of have 6 million tons plus contained metal.
And
And
can I ask? Yeah.
You go ahead.
Well, just I wonder about private conversations with tech, right? How far out they think you might be able to go on this curve.
I think they feel like we do, and I don't want to put words in their mouth. But they see the prospectivity here, right? And that's our opportunity is to try to improve that. You look at some of the Taylor, which you see on there. About 3 times what we've currently delineated, but it's sold for 1.8 billion.
Yeah.
So it kind of gives you the
right
scale
here.
of, shows you what's possible if you grow this thing, right?
Wonderful.
And that's what we want to try to do is grow it and be one of the elite, be one of the big ones. And this has been a depressed base metal market. But
Taylor's 3 times the size almost. You have McMillan Pass there at 50 million tons, and you talk about Taylor at nearly 150 and similar grade. So you talk about tripling, right? What a target to have.
Yeah, and I think that you think about which deposits have done well recently, or which ones have got really good attention. And it's trying to think. You've got Taylor has obviously done very well for itself. Navasung, which had the TMOC. TMOC did well twice, right?
Yeah, really.
Effectively. So it's that scale of deposit. Kamoa obviously with Ivanhoe and the DRC is doing extremely well. That's a pretty special deposit. Those are the true tier ones of the base metal. And then there's a group after that, which we would consider to be the rest of the world class by any definition, which includes us. But we want to inch up towards that tier 1 level, right?
Wonderful.
Where you're simply, where everyone's fighting for your project.
Yeah, it's amazing how sparse it is up there. There's a lot of dots on that chart, but
not many, beyond that lower corner, right?
Wonderful. And the deposit model here.
Yeah, that's just showing, adjacent, for example, that we believe the 2 sides of the syncline are connected. So it doesn't require a lot of imagination to see if there's going to be extra tons there.
Yeah, I always wonder how these things end up getting twisted and turned up in the mountains there the way they do. It's fascinating.
Yeah. A whole lot of, that was flat lying, and then the Cordilleran event in the Cretaceous really deformed the hell out of it, right?
Yeah.
So that provides some challenges and opportunities for exploration.
Well, and the question of, is it open at depth, right? If there's been all kinds of stuff happen, potential for isolated pods and weird things going on.
Yeah, no, and that's why you got to hire the best brains in the business to do your structural modeling, right?
Yeah,
because that's critical. You can blow your budget pretty quickly chasing dead ends if you don't understand your structure.
Well, and if they don't have a mandate to explore for high grade, right? Good for you for setting that as a clear goal, right?
Yeah.
Exploration.
Yeah, and I mean, like we don't explore just for high grade. It's kind of like there's a um, sometimes low grade if it is
Oh
bulk
yeah.
mineable at surface can have all the margin of high grade at depth, right? So you gotta understand what the engineering realities of any given ton are.
Yep. And thinking about drilling up dip, I see there's some holes here from one side coming in. Is there potential for more, you know, infill kind of programs on these veins coming up from these old workings?
Yeah, up dip, I'd be surprised. I mean, they're not veins; they're stratiform, but
Thank you. Thank you.
um, I think up is pretty much
Thank
sterilized
you.
because we can trace it all the way to the surface, and we know it doesn't extend above the surface. Um,
It's
so,
good. Good.
um, so the question is at depth. That Tom East in particular was they thought they had sterilized it to depth, and we showed that there was deformation there that perhaps showed that, well,
Uh-huh.
not perhaps, definitely showed that they missed some mineralization. The
Well,
question is how much.
thank you. Thank you. Very relevant to the point you just made about having the right structural geologist and the smartest people in the business working for you.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you go like to the appendix of the presentation, just a little bit about um, the land package. Yeah, go back up. There you go. Yeah, so this was put out in May last year. Kind of hit what we wanted to see, which was a healthy IRR, a healthy MPV, and a long mine life. But people don't need to get married to this scenario because your PEA is your first pass, and then you work on and look, a PEA is a guide for investors. It's a guide for partners, but it's also a guide for management
Yeah.
because a PEA tells you, okay, this is your project with a pretty basic mine plan. Where do you need to improve it? Where is the money coming from and where is it going to? Um, and that helps you decide what is important in terms of exploration and engineering and what you need to figure out first. What are the major risks and opportunities? So we see with the tons that we've been adding and the engineering work we've done that we can make this a lot better.
Yeah. Wonderful. Very glad to see projected cash flows that are not just a flat line here. There's some variation in that, which indicates some careful planning, I think, to some degree.
Yeah, you try to, and you can see there it's front loaded as best we could, which is best for your IRR and MPV. But underground, you sometimes have more flexibility than open pit, but it's capital intensive to try to start deep, right?
Yeah.
So you got to decide whether it's worth eating the capital to start at depth or whether you start with more shallow zones.
Well, and this is this question about is there more shallow grade is there more high grade at shallow locations, whether, in known envelopes or outside, this
Yeah,
is the exploration story that you have at play.
yeah, no, exactly.
Wonderful. Is there anything else you draw our attention to in the pitch deck here?
No, I think you got it right. I mean, pay attention to the rest of our results this summer, and I think that this pitch deck was really built for pre-summer priming people for exploration.
Yeah.
Whereas I think that the post-summer pitch deck is really going to be about, okay, here's where we're at, and here's how things are improving.
And do things stand to change significantly looking forward?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, and I think if you particularly, the recent ore sorting news release around Boundary Zone, and I think the upcoming drill holes at Boundary Zone, hopefully help people wrap their heads around, how much this project is changing.
Right? You start finding new zones, significant step outs. This is multiplying the scale of the project, right?
Yeah, and I think I understand the imperatives facing junior mining CEOs, but it always frustrates me a bit when I see CEOs who are doing these super timid step outs, because they're just so afraid of not hitting the zone, right? And it's like, well, that's great, but you're not changing anything either, right?
Yeah, really.
Some that won't be named who have pin cushioned little zones so much that there's not more than 10 meters between intersections, right?
Yeah.
And I think that the boundary zone is please 15 kilometers from Tom and Jason, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I don't know, a much bigger step out, and I think
Yeah.
target G that we're expecting some results on is a good 25 kilometers from those two. So
Yeah.
we're doing real regional stuff.
And yet it's, you still think about that 800-kilometer number that you mentioned earlier, right?
Yeah.
And that as a trucking distance, you put that in relation to those distances between them, and the calculations change a little bit, right? So,
Yeah.
Mr. MacDonald, thank you very much for talking with me.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks a lot for having me.
Bye.